ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. As Russia continues its unlawful full-scale aggression on Ukraine, a hidden crisis is unfolding within its own ranks. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have gone absent without leave, deserted, or refused orders since the invasion began in 2022. Behind the Kremlin's narrative of strength lies a fractured and demoralized military, plagued by poor leadership, brutal discipline, and collapsing morale. Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, its military courts have been overwhelmed, not just with war logistics but with justice. Over 20,500 cases of soldiers going AWOL, deserting or refusing orders have landed on judges' desks. That's not battlefield attrition, it's a crisis of loyalty. The majority, more than 18,000 cases, concern soldiers simply walking away. Article 337 of Russia's criminal code brands this as a punishable offense, carrying up to 10 years behind bars. And the courts are not lenient. Over 17,700 of these cases have resulted in convictions. It is a phenomenon that exposes the darker truth behind the Kremlin's war machine. According to the UK's Ministry of Defence, it is not just fear or fatigue pushing soldiers to flee. It is what happens behind Russian lines.
There are a range of factors that can lead a soldier to desert. Brutal discipline in the Russian armed forces, poor medical treatment for injured soldiers, and inadequate military training all likely contribute to a Russian service personnel going AWOL.
This desertion wave contradicts Moscow's official messaging. The Kremlin projects unity and pride, but behind the medals and parades, the Russian army is bleeding from within. The Kremlin keeps tightening the screws. In April 2023, Russia increased penalties for avoiding the draft, but laws won't stop the exodus, like the one you see here. According to the Institute for the Study of War, over 50,000 Russian troops have deserted since 2022. It's a quiet rebellion that won't be acknowledged in Red Square speeches, but on paper, in courtrooms, and in the silence of abandoned barracks, it is impossible to ignore. For every soldier that flees, a myth dies. And for Russia's generals, the numbers don't lie. History, it seems, is being rewritten by those who choose not to fight.
And now let's zone in on the East-plaining portion of our show. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Vladimir Putin promised that no conscript would be sent to the front. But that vow didn't last. Since then, Russia has transformed its entire approach to conscription, scaling up, digitizing, and forcing thousands into service. Here's how it unfolded.
It began with denial. In early 2022, the Kremlin insisted only professional soldiers were fighting in Ukraine. But as battlefield losses mounted, the narrative cracked. By September of that year, Russia launched a so-called partial mobilization, calling up to 300,000 reservists, the country's first large-scale draft since World War II. With resistance growing, the state changed tactics. In 2023, it digitized the draft. A new law enabled electronic summonses to be delivered through the government's Gosuslugi portal. Ignoring the summons now triggers automatic penalties, like losing your driver's license, having your bank account frozen, or being banned from leaving the country. Meanwhile, the age range expanded. In 2024, Russia raised the upper limit for conscription from 27 to 30 years old, and drop numbers kept rising. This spring, the Kremlin called up 160,000 men, the highest number in over a decade. But the draft isn't limited to Russia's borders. In occupied areas of Ukraine, particularly in Donetsk, Luhansk and Zaporizhia, men have been forcibly conscripted into the Russian army. Rights groups warn these actions violate international law and may amount to war crimes. All this comes as Russian casualties continue to climb. Western estimates say over 750,000 soldiers have been killed or wounded. With professional forces depleted, conscription is no longer a backup plan. It is the core of Russia's war strategy.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Russia's summer offensive in eastern Ukraine continues to grind forward. Beneath the surface of its apparent momentum lies a leaking military force plagued by dysfunction, corruption, and mass desertion. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Russian courts have handled over 20,500 cases of soldiers going absent without leave, deserting, or just refusing orders. Nearly 90%, more than 18,000, were for AWOL alone, and over 17,700 of those resulted in prosecution. Now, this growing wave of abandonment reflects deep structural failures in Russia's armed forces. Experts note the military is incapable of conducting complex operations due to the poor state of intelligence services, logistical breakdowns, and widespread corruption. Commanders often lie about battlefield gains to secure promotions, leaving soldiers unsupported and exposed. The situation has bred desperation. Russia has lost over 1 million soldiers killed or wounded since 2022, according to Ukrainian sources. Now, pro-war military bloggers have published footage of wounded troops left to die in the snow, some choosing suicide over abandonment. Reports describe punishment regimes, including forced suicide missions and caging dissenting soldiers. Morale is in freefall. Frontline troops are now forced to buy their own gear, drones, body armor, even food via online fundraisers. As domestic support dries up and trust in leadership erodes, the desertion rate continues to climb. Russia's military may still advance, but its foundation is rotting from within. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Mark McNamee, a co-founder of Ukraine Business News Network. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So today we're trying to examine the state of the Russian army. Ever since the full-scale invasion began, we heard a lot about how disorganized and dysfunctional it is. But, well, after seeing some of these reports, I'm also wary about kind of drinking our own Kool-Aid and being a little bit overly optimistic about it. Can you help us break down what's the actual situation within the rank of the Russian army, and why are they still able to kind of push on despite the reports of all these dysfunction?
Yeah, well, I guess the line that has become famous the last couple of years is that quantity has a quality in and of itself, right? So you may not have the best soldiers in the world. They may not be of the highest morale, the best training, marksmanship, et cetera, et cetera. However, when you have a lot of them and you have this willingness on the part of the military to make monumental sacrifices every day for years, that has a quality in and of itself that allows for some territorial gains. Now, I mean, we would never say that this is worth it in the Western world. From Putin's point of view, currently, under, again, specifically current conditions, it's worth it to Putin in the Kremlin. But yes, this is they're able to make some advances, not because they're necessarily learning very quickly, though there is some adaptation and learning going on, of course, but mostly because they have the high manpower levels, just the sheer quantity of individuals that they can keep throwing at the fight. But morale remains extraordinarily low on the front, and we have endless evidence supporting this consistently now for multiple years. And we have, there's just the report recently about high levels of away without leave, AWOL, Russian soldiers. We have horrific reports of how Russian leadership commanders treat the soldiers, but particularly the soldiers who are unwilling to go on some of these suicide missions, or the deserters who are caught, and things of that nature. So all of that obviously paints a picture of a quite low morale military, but under enough coercion and pressure, with enough numbers, it can continue and they can make some modest gains.
Right, so like I mentioned, they're perhaps choosing quantity over quality, and at the moment it seems to be, well, at least Vladimir Putin think it is worth it. But is there some point where it's just no longer sustainable with like the number of desertions, people going AWOL, and a lot of soldiers not wanting to go on the battlefield?
Yeah, so theoretically, sure, we could get to that point, but I would say that we shouldn't be looking at the battlefront for mass desertions and then sort of Russia relinquishing its gains and moving back on its own. We shouldn't be looking for that in the relatively near future as a potential sort of game-changing moment. But instead, what we should be looking at are the indirect effects of taking so many men out of the Russian domestic labor force, out of the economy, moving them to the front, and the extraordinary, not just fatalities, but overall casualties. So when these guys are injured, they can't go back to the battlefield. They actually can't return back to civilian life and contribute back to the economy. Many of them can't work again. So the issue being indirectly the macroeconomic and financial instability over time that could occur. Now that can happen with the right Western policies, right? Enough sanctions pressure. We can intensify the sanctions, go after Russia's oil exports, go after some financial sanctions as well, go after international trade a bit deeper, matched with the labor market pressures that are happening, which is keeping up this persistently high inflation that's driving up high interest rates. And we could maximize this pressure and intensify it, make it much more severe in the coming weeks and months, that would help bring about potentially at least a ceasefire or a calming or a moderation of hostilities, as opposed to necessarily looking at the front alone and hoping that the poor morale continues to worsen and then you start to see just simply on the front, on the battlefield, a moderation of hostilities because of enough desertions and other issues with AWOL and other things like that. So we should probably looking more at the domestic economy, taking so many men out and what that means for macroeconomic stability longer term.
All right, so let's take a look at behind the scenes because Russia have essentially turned its whole economy into a wartime economy. But like you mentioned, there's also a problem with manpower, with so many men being drafted into the war. Is that in and of itself sustainable as well? Because I can't see all of this functioning with all the dysfunction that's going on.
Right. No, it's not sustainable. I mean, of course, it's been sustainable and it can go on for some period of time, but it depends upon, I guess, again, Western pressure in particular, making the macroeconomic problems that much more acute. But no, this isn't sustainable. They don't have an endless reserve of manpower. And we use these analogies like, well, in World War II, they just threw all these guys at the front. It was a massively different nation at the time. This, primarily agricultural nation. You still had high levels of illiteracy. You're pulling a lot of guys off of farms in central Russia and Siberia and sending them to the front. That's not the situation anymore. So that's not to say that Russia doesn't have a certain level of resilience that they still can tap into. I mean, they have a very large population, of course, that they can continue to tap into. But it's not like earlier generations where you sort of have this bottomless pit of human beings to continue to throw at the front. That's not the situation. And so now you're pulling more and more men out, depleting the domestic economy, and there is a breaking point at some point. I would say, I firmly believe that with we look at the tempo of hostilities, the level of casualties, suffering between 1,000 and 1,500 guys a day, basically consistently for the last 9+ months. Can they continue that indefinitely, forever? Absolutely not. How long can they continue that for? It's a little bit more difficult to say, but I mean, in this analyst's opinion, I would say they could do this another 6 months. Sure, another year, that becomes much more questionable. Beyond that, having not only the financial resources, having the manpower resources, that might be a problem, but then the financial resources, because they're convincing people to sign up by these extraordinarily large payouts. How do they continue that, particularly if we have tougher Western sanctions, if the government is receiving less energy export revenue? This is all sustainable currently and for the coming months, but in 6 months from now, 9 months from now, a year from now, if Russia is intent on continuing with this level of intensity of attacks and severe loss of manpower, no, I don't believe this is sustainable. Again, at this level of intensity, say for 9 months, a year longer and beyond. But again, critical part here is the West can play a role in this and make that timeline even shorter if we do implement these sanctions soon, and we don't just hold these sanctions on paper, we actually implement them strongly. And the positive sign is that the last few months, the Western sanctions going after the shadow fleet are encouraging. So we have seen a clear impact since the beginning of the year on Russia's energy export revenues, both because global prices have come down, but also because we have successfully been actually going after Russia's shadow fleet finally.
Right, so all these issues that you mentioned have been very glaring, and it's very hard to imagine within the Russian ranks this is going unnoticed. So what do you think that they will try, like how will they try to solve it, and why do they persist on doing things the way they do? Is it because of the lack of political will, or are there just no viable solution at this point?
Well, I would say one thing is that don't necessarily think that Putin or the immediate coterie around him in the Kremlin are necessarily thinking about where things will be in 18 months or in 3 years or in 5, 10 years. They know end game. Ukraine belongs back under Moscow's domination. Ukraine doesn't exist on its own, and it has to be under the Russian sort of administration. So they know they need to get to that point, but they're much more sort of adaptive in their tactics of getting there. So and this has been Putin's modus operandi since he came into power 25 years ago. He's famously known for being a judo star, using that mentality of sort of acting in the present, taking opportunities as they come and adapting, being flexible, dealing with an issue tomorrow as it comes, delaying, stalling for as long as you can on certain things like we see with the ceasefire talks, and then watching events develop and see where we are in a week or so. More opportunistic type policymaking as opposed to this is how it has to be and we're going to do this. And it's more, let's see where we are next week, and then maybe we continue that same policy.
All right, so speaking of this kind of opportunistic sort of policy making, do you think that the Western world or even the Trump administration will be able to offer some sort of attractive off-ramp for them to get themselves out of this muddy situation as well and negotiate perhaps something that is favorable to Ukraine?
Not at all, because Russia has determined their maximalist demands, and Putin has reiterated them again repeatedly since Trump has come into office, even with the West's ceasefire overtures. The Kremlin and Putin himself have reiterated again their maximalist demands of essentially we want to dominate all of Ukraine. Zelensky can't be a leader. We would essentially be installing our own puppet leader. No Western military support to Ukraine. No Western soldiers, of course, in Ukraine. Ukraine demilitarize Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. Ukraine can't be a state. Can't have its own freedom. Can't have its own sovereignty, in essence. So there's nothing that the West can actually give because Ukraine, not to mention Europeans, but Ukraine has a vote in this, and they are voting, and they're doing it every day, and they're fighting and dying for their country, fighting against Russia, resisting Moscow's imperialism. So there's nothing to really offer. The only thing to truly do from the West, and this has been apparent since the start of the war, this has been apparent in nearly every Soviet or Russian interaction with the West over the last century plus, Russia recognizes strength only. So peace through strength, which is what Trump campaigned on. He after he was elected in November, December, January, before his inauguration, talked about, have we seen peace through strength the last several months, though? Not necessarily, but that's where the policy has to move towards if we want to see an actual resolution to this war. Not that Russia's going to ever end this war voluntarily. They will have to be forced to stop this war.
Right. So, yeah, like I said, Russia, it doesn't look like they are going to give up anytime soon. But again, on the other hand, we are also looking at the downward trajectory of its economy. It's like military not really functioning as well. Do you think that there will be a critical point where they have to acknowledge themselves that this is not sustainable, this can't go forward? It's really hard to kind of bridge that disconnect.
Right. And I do. I do believe that they are going to come to that breaking point. They don't have bottomless resources in terms of manpower, in terms of equipment, in terms of the financing required for this, and everything is going in a downward trajectory for Russia's ability to prosecute this war at the intensity that they're prosecuting it. They can choose, say later this year or next year at some point, to return back to, for example, the status of the war, say in 2016, 17, 18, where it was still a hot conflict, but the kinetic nature of the war was far more moderate than what we've seen for the last 3 years, and particularly for the last year. So they can return to something like that, but they're going to need extreme pressure from the West to encourage them to move in that direction. And unfortunately, we're I would say a minimum of 6 to 9 months away from that.
All right, so it does seem like the West putting pressure on Russia is the only way to accelerate things and perhaps moving towards peace. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Ukraine is moving forward with plans to hold Russia accountable for its full-scale invasion. President Zelensky has now signed off on a major step towards establishing a special war tribunal.
Volodymyr Zelensky has signed the ratification document for the core agreement behind a future special tribunal for the crime of aggression. The new international mechanism, backed by Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland, will operate outside the constraints of the UN Security Council, where Russia holds veto power. It aims to prosecute the top Kremlin leadership for launching the 2022 invasion, bypassing immunity normally granted to heads of state. Zelensky stressed the importance of legal accountability at the highest levels, calling the tribunal a tool for justice and deterrence. The court is expected to be based in The Hague and operate alongside the International Criminal Court.
Kyiv has received a fresh cash injection from the International Monetary Fund. The latest disbursement signals growing confidence in Ukraine's wartime economic stability.
Ukraine has secured a $500 million disbursement from the IMF under a larger $15.6 billion aid package. The latest tranche brings the total funding since March 2023 to $3.6 billion. According to the IMF, Ukraine's economy continues to demonstrate resilience, with GDP growth in 2025 projected at between 3 and 4%. The funding is tied to Kyiv's reform progress, including tax policy, banking oversight and transparency improvements. The IMF's mission in May confirmed that Ukraine has met all key targets under the extended fund facility, even amid war.
A major figure in Russia's defense ministry has been sentenced to over a decade in prison. The Kremlin is signaling a new anti-corruption posture, at least on the surface.
Former Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov has been sentenced to 13 years in prison for accepting massive bribes. Russian investigators say Ivanov used his position to siphon off millions through inflated military construction contracts. Once considered a close ally of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, Ivanov's downfall comes amid growing internal pressure over Russia's costly war in Ukraine. The Kremlin has launched a series of corruption probes in recent months. Some analysts view them as power plays within the elite. Ivanov will serve his sentence in a high-security prison and must forfeit over $5 million in assets.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.